If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall explore the history of the Underworld and how it was formed. We will discuss the formation of the Dark Kingdom of Iron, the largest and perhaps the most important kingdom in the Underworld in Wraith the Oblivion. Welcome back, young explorer. It's a pleasure to see you again. It makes me really happy to see you all keen and ready to learn more about a variety of ghosts. I'm afraid, however, I'm going to have to burst that little jolly bubble of yours as we step away from all of that for a hot minute. Well, it's more a sidestep if I'm being totally honest. We know that spectres occupy a horrid space called the Labyrinth, which we'll explore another night. But what about the home of Wraiths? I told you that their world is a darker version of our own, but that is relatively close to the Skinlands. There are spaces between that and the Labyrinth. Many a dark kingdom occupy pockets of stable reality within the Tempest, violent stormy seas of the Underworld. Each of these dark kingdoms claims dominion over the Wraiths of a particular geographical region of our world, and here's a few of them for you. The Dark Kingdom of Clay, Carter, is home to the Aborigines of Australia. The Dark Kingdom of Ivory, the Bush of Ghosts, which claims authority over the dead of Africa. The Dark Kingdom of Jade, the Yellow Springs, home to the Asian dead. You also have the Dark Kingdom of Obsidian, the original Dark Kingdoms of the Americas, the North American islands of Flint, the Mesoamerican Flayed Lands, and the South American lands of gold. And let us not forget the Dark Kingdom of Sand, Amenti, home of the gods and undying of ancient Egypt. And of course, you have the Dark Kingdom of Iron, which I would like to focus on tonight's session, if that's alright with you. Good. This Dark Kingdom of Iron began as the underworld for the Mediterranean countries, but over the centuries has grown to claim most of the Western world. But before we look at that, one has to start at the beginning and talk about how everything was formed. Now, there is no need to roll your eyes at me. It's all very important stuff, you know. You remember that in a time long forgotten by the mortals, there was once never a true distinction of the lands of the living and the dead. The deceased could return to visit their loved ones and interact in small ways. After some time, a great convulsion shook the earth, separated the two worlds, raising a barrier between them. This event was called the Sundering, and the barrier is called the Shroud. This event also affected the nature of Oblivion. Our records tell us it was once a manifestation of passive destruction, rather than a ravenous corrupter. Essentially, it was the very embodiment of life and death. With the erection of the Shroud, the restless dead saw no purpose of carrying on. Oblivion reached out and poked the mind of Wraiths. It woke up to the vicious, selfish part of the Wraiths and gave this darkness a voice. Of course, we know this voice is called the Shadow. We also understand the Oblivion also created the monstrosities known as spectres into the labyrinth they call home, as well as other macabre creatures. It must have been a horrifying time for the race, but there was hope. The Lady of Fate stood before them and spoke of a great leader who would rise, journey down the river of death, and guide souls to the safety of the far shores, where eternal shelter from oblivion awaited. She is one of the most powerful and enigmatic figures known in the Underworld, and certainly one of the most influential in the shaping of the Underworld. We have collected documents from across the world that has collectively suggested that she may not be a Wraith at all, but some entity of her own right. Some have suggested that she may be Eve, as in the significant other of Adam. Other records state she may be Lilith, but you can make your own decisions as you see fit. But I digress. Sorry, I don't know what came over me then. Anyway, this beacon of light, so to speak, was a man by the name of Charon, or Charon. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but I shall refer to him as Charon. Anyway, with her counsel, Charon sailed to the seas of the Underworld, learned its secrets so he could guide the Wraiths to safety. This safe spot was an Isle of Sorrows, a rocky island located at the delta of the River of Death, deep in the Tempest. It serves as the base of the kingdom's capital, Stygia. It is surrounded by the Sea of Souls, which serves as the island and city's main barrier against the threats from the Sunless Sea and the Tempest. Charon would become their leader, teaching them how to sail the tempests, seeking eternal rest elsewhere if they so choose. There were those that needed an escort following Charon. These were called ferrymen. They swore an oath to Charon and each other, exchanging information to protecting those that needed to travel. Some of these broke off to find alternate routes that would bring the tranquility they originally sought. These ferrymen would become the Shining Ones. Now you may be curious how payment might have worked then for such services. We understand that there was no real currency for Wraiths to hire ferrymen, so their services were bargained with instead. This would change to leaving a coin over each eye of the person who died in order to pay for their crossing. The currency also changed once more, but that's a conversation for another night. The Lady of Fate would return to Charon, convincing him to take his fight to the labyrinth, armed with only a lantern and a scythe. The information we have collected on his doings are vague and conflicting, topics we should explore properly in another night. What we do know is that he was returned to the Isle of Sorrows. He brought a wraith by the name of Nutri, a long-time prisoner of Oblivion. Nutri is an expert soulcrafter, who I think we should discuss another time. To put this on a timeline, we believe this return occurred around about the 3rd century BCE. Via a special horn, Charon summoned the ferryman and expressed his disappointment. The Oblivion had grown and was scolded for their inability to prevent the spread of Oblivion. Charon appeared to be more pleased or more intrigued by the findings of the Shining Ones, who spoke of the halls of the dead, housing warriors, thinkers, and the like. He would travel there for many years, leaving the ferrymen to carry on with their duties. When Charon returned again, the Roman Empire rose in the Skinlands and had 7 signs bestowed to him by the Shining Ones, who had then started to claim dominion in the Sunless Seas. These literal signs were placed in a huge iron tablet and built a new city, collecting stones from the cities that laid before it. The likes of Sparta, Athens, and Jericho were reborn as a new fortress and a tavern lighthouse that shone a beacon of hope for the safety of the souls. You could argue it also served as a monument to Charon for the deeds he had accomplished. The city that was founded upon 7 hills on the Isle of Sorrows was named Stygia. Charon used the Roman Republic as the basis of his new empire that stood for a few centuries. 7 of his most trusted lieutenants would become the Senate, following the Shining Ones to construct temples for refugees to sail the far shores. They opened their doors to emissaries to other kingdoms, discussing common problems, needs, and so forth. Some of our records state that Stygians, yes, that really is a thing, gave the titles to the kingdoms I spoke of before. Nidri built strong weapons and armors for those who were tasked to protect the city, in addition to the creation of a network of roads that would cut through the Tempest, countering the efforts of Oblivion and Spectres. As the Skinlands Roman Empire grew, Stygia mirrored it. Of course, many of the soldiers in these conflicts across Europe and bits of Africa would join the forces of Stygia. Not all accepted Charon's rule, of course. These became the Renegades, which was responded by the formation of Charon's equities, aiding ferrymen and the disposing of renegades, many of which were the followers of Jesus Christ. You might have noticed, Explorer, that whilst the darkness was being fought on the field of battle, not much was being done for the mind and soul. The Lady of Fate reminded Charon of this, resulting in him creating halls and collecting humanity's greatest works. As Rome fell, so did the first incarnation of Stygia. Spectres claimed the lives of the barbarians and mad rulers aplenty, swarming Stygia as they once did Rome. This also coincided in the first of 5 great Maelstroms, near-apocalyptic winds that left Stygia in ruin. Charon and his ferrymen fought the forces of Oblivion and were not present for the Stygia's destruction. On the coattails of the Maelstrom, more spectres attacked, destroying what the Maelstrom had spared. There was a victory for the Stygians, of course, but it was a very hollow one. From here onwards, things become a little darker, just to let you know. Just let me know and I'll pause the discussion for you if needed. Charon would begin building a stronger Stygia. He would call himself Emperor, and his 7 senators would become Death Lords, acting as stewards of a different group of souls, or legions, as we discussed during our first conversation. The Lady of Fate led the 8th. we are told that the Death Lords wear masks to represent their new role, no longer a singular wraith, but the guardian of many. The ferrymen were not too pleased with Charon calling himself Emperor, many of whom chose to join the renegades, but most refused to work with Charon. Like all good emperors, Charon struck their names from the records and throw them out to defend themselves, which they do. Some continue their work in fighting back Oblivion, while subtly reducing the power of Stygia, whilst others succumbed to their shadow as they lost their purpose. Those that remained alongside those who fought against the remnants of the first great Maelstrom as the city was rebuilt were awarded for their efforts. From our studies, the rewards were very few and rather minor. Now, you could argue that one fought not for the money or fame, but had a duty to perform. Of course, we both know that there are those who want nothing more than riches and bragging rights. Stygia would soon alter to fit the medieval kingdoms of Europe, founding the hierarchy. Charon was at the top, the Death Lords beneath him, the equities were now knights, and the loyal ferrymen were just below them. The lowest ranks were serfs, wraiths by the title of thralls, who existed purely as slaves or as a payment for the higher classes. At some point, the Shining Ones had returned from a long voyage just after their founding. An agreement called the Treaty of Paradise allowed the Shining Ones to take on any wraiths that sought paradise, in exchange for their relics. Remember this, because this will be very important later on. The guilds were also formed, sitting just below the legions and knights in power, where they cultivated and exchanged the secrets of their powers, the Arconi. It is stated that Charon claimed the various guild formations, which is not true. They retaliated by using their gifts freely, poking through the shroud as demons and devils to frighten and control the mortals. Charon responded with the Dictum Mortem, the Code of the Dead. It stated no wraith was to penetrate the shroud under any circumstance, no contact with the living was allowed, no attempts to impart their potential future or harass the quick, the mortals. This also included the taking of a life, be it their own or another. As one might expect, this is broken far more than it is upheld. As I hope you'd know, the year 1347 brought the Black Plague, naturally bringing about a large number of wraiths, insane numbers Stygia could not hold. It also brought about the second great Maelstrom, which did not obliterate Stygia as it did the first, thanks to the craftsmanship of Nudri. When Charon taxed the masses, the Shining Ones revolted, preparing their own Crusader Knights and Death Bishops. Yes, it is quite bizarre, really. Anyway, Charon demanded these knights and bishops would be disbanded. They didn't, and mounted an attack on Charon's residence, the Onyx Tower. Charon, not a complete idiot, prepared for this and fortified his tower. Charon won, burning captives for 7 days for all to see, and ransacked the temple of the Shining Ones, finding they had hoarded information for themselves, breaking the Treaty of Paradise. Yes, they were banished from Stygia, taking what they could with them. We know that the Shining Ones were actually heretics of sorts, forcing those under them into slavery, acting against Charon and the Lady of Fate for God knows how long, denying those under their watch transcendence, not fighting the might of Oblivion. The Shining Ones had abused Charon's trust, only interested in fostering power. Charon claimed them heretics, seeking their eradication through the Proclamation of Reason. He formed the Magisterium Veratius, or the Council of Inquisitors in English, which took their model after the Inquisition of Europe. Why do you look so frightened? During the 16th century, Stygia became under siege as renegades attacked the city walls and the heretics attempted to corrupt the minds of the Stygians, resulting in paranoia galore. From this arose an event known as the Three Abominations. One took place outside Stygia, one within, and one very far away. The first abomination, the looting of artifacts, involved just that. Renegades invaded the Onyx Tower and stole many an artifact. The knights ultimately won the battle, but many lives on both sides were lost. The second abomination, the breaking of the guilds, took place within the walls as the guild struck Charon and the Death Lords in 1598. Despite their common goal, their own differences is what brought about their failure. Our records state that Nudri's original apprentices, to which there were 3, were killed. Despite not officially existing anymore, we know they still very much exist, the guilds I mean. Finally, the third abomination, the Flaying of Obsidian, mimicked the pillaging of the mortals who travelled the Atlantic to the New World America, as Charon's forces discovered the Dark Kingdom of Obsidian. This was not an event dictated by shadows, but the wraiths themselves. An entire nation, destroyed by free will, mostly performed by their heretics. You might be detecting a pattern here. Truly disgusting things happen, and the Shadowlands respond. The third Great Maelstrom emerged and, according to our notes, was the most violent one at that point. A Nephrak by the name of Coldheart led divisions from the labyrinth to feed and tear on the anger brewed by the hierarchy, renegades, and heretics. Lightning split the sky, Oblivion cloaked everything in black fog, and howling winds separated Stygia from the rest of the Shadowlands. A whole island just moved by wind. I can't even begin to comprehend what that would have done to the mortal frame, let alone the corpus of a Wraith. Again, Stygia recovered, with Wraiths being allowed to carry swords made out of soul steel, letting only the strong reside, allowing industry to sweep across Europe just as it started to do in the Skinlands. This isn't me being terrible with dates, we just don't know all the facts, but if you were to ask my opinion, I am entitled to believe that these storms, and indeed the healing process, took hundreds of years. Anyway, as you can imagine, Jaron became more debased as he enforced slavery. According to our studies, his logic dictated that it was to prevent them, the slaves, being taken by Oblivion. No, I didn't think that was going to convince you, and I wasn't trying to either, but it was just one of those things, unfortunately. The Industrial Revolution brought just as many changes to Wraith society as it did to us in the land of the living. Stygia had iron ships for cargo, many revolutionary thinker and scientists joined their numbers. Many mortals died without strong passions, as they were now focused on more material things like capitalism than those around them and their previous faiths, meaning souls were lost to Oblivion quite frequently. What was once temples for shining ones had become large-scale factories. The effects of the third Great Maelstrom choked the life out of the once swiftly flowing river of death, making it no longer passable, and Stygia's grand bridges were destroyed. Jaron decided to build cities outside of Stygia, which provided some relief to its swollen numbers. With permission from Charon, the legions built a necropolis, a city for the dead by the dead, located within London. A new Amsterdam was built also, both of which surviving onslaughts by heretics and renegades. But then something interesting happened, Explorer. Charon decided to visit the Shadowlands to see the state of it, but his being began to fade. His followers attempted to do so to find the same effect. Now, this isn't common knowledge, so don't ask me how I acquired it. The Death Lords squabbled amongst themselves to try and determine what happened and why, whilst blaming it on the heretics and renegades. Charon locked himself away with no statement, leaving the Death Lords to rule in his stead. We know that the Death Lords acted as tyrants, not really working together. The effect this had on Stygia is that it began to rot from the inside as Wraiths lost their sense of meaning and continuity. The walls of Stygia were packed once more as World War I obliterated countless innocent lives and soldiers aplenty, who were all being shipped all over the place. Additional cities were built that essentially became massive barracks of the dead. Both of these things, Explorer, World War I, and the hellish influx brought about the fourth Great Maelstrom. Frozen hails punctured the towers, and the spectres that rode in on these winds drove the Denzians insane. The city held together but was somehow cleaner. The hail washed away the smog and muck. One source said it had a mirror-like brilliance, which is an interesting comment given all the mirrors I've ever seen have been stained with spittle. Anyway, the necropoly did not look so great, and spectres infiltrated and snuck into the Skinlands, particularly in New York and Chicago. If you haven't caught my drift, spectres are not only the cause for crimes and murders shortly after World War I, but the Great Depression also. It was during all of this when Charon stopped sulking and came out of his chamber and assembled bounty hunters called Doomslayers to take down the spectres. There is more to them than that, but we will require a separate night for that conversation, Explorer. It has also been suggested that the spectres played a part in influencing certain individuals that played their part in the atrocities that surround World War II, while some of our rival ghost hunters may be interested in the necropoly, Dark Kingdom and information regarding this, we at the Phoenix Institute do not. I don't think we need to talk about that much more, do you? Good. Moving on. Whilst you would expect this to cause another Great Maelstrom, it was actually the new weapon the Americans invented, the nuclear bomb. The explosion at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was so great that it pierced the shroud. Records state that the Underworld was literally on fire, blinding anyone who looked at these intense moments of brightness. Anyone caught in this intense wind was sent straight to Oblivion. The necropoly were cut off from each other in the wake of smaller maelstroms, as spectres attacked citadels, turning what they could into ruined islands. It also released a foul, hungry Malthian by the name of Gurul from the labyrinth, who devoured devoured anything in its path, destroying warships like toys. Jaron called for help to slay the beast, but none of the Devlords were prepared to leave his or her seat of power and have someone replace it, so Jaron faced the beast by his lonesome in his red boat, as his once former noble self did. To put a long story short, the two fought, unable to best the other. Jaron created a whirlpool, dragging the beast with him, although some say the beast simply followed Charon. The loss of Charon was felt across Stygia. His departure and presumably death was mourned by the residents of Stygia and the Deathlords, swearing to uphold Charon's virtues, praising his love and valor. They promised they would learn from his mistakes and let Stygia prosper. They did no such thing, as the Deathlords began fighting amongst themselves as smaller Maelstroms come and go, necropoli crumble, and the Wraiths live in relative peace. As you probably have worked out by now, there is a lot of unpleasantries that fuel the city of Stygia, but that will have to wait for another time. The groundsman wants us off the cemetery again. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.